For more, let's cross now to freelance reporter Simeon Tegel, who joins us from Lima. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. Simeon, we were seeing those images on Tuesday of Alan Garcia staunchly denying any wrongdoing. I imagine that the shock is still there this Thursday.
Yes, I mean, the news of Alan Garcia's suicide, I think it's fair to say, has rocked the country. It's possibly traumatized the country, but I would have to say that the country is not in mourning, unlike those party members from the party of Alan Garcia, whose support has just fallen catastrophically since Alan Garcia's last government ended in 2011. He was widely perceived by the Peruvian population to be corrupt, but also to have been very adept at covering up his tracks. And in the last year or two, his disapproval rating has been hovering around 90%.
He's someone who's been for so long on the political scene. He was back in the 1980s, one of Latin America's youngest head of states.
Yes, that's correct. He was president for the first time from 1985 to 1990. At that time, he was somewhat left-wing. He got into a very big spat with the IMF, and his first government ended really with national catastrophe, hyperinflation, and it was under Garcia's watch that the Shining Path, so Maoist terrorists, who started a war, an internal conflict in which 70,000 people died, they really rose to prominence while he was in charge. So it's actually very surprising he could get elected again president after that. But he managed to do that in 2006, largely because his main opponent was advocating Chavista or Venezuelan policies, which really concerned most Peruvians. And then his second term, there were all kinds of issues with that. Perhaps the most famous scandal at the time was the so-called narco pardon scandal, in which it emerged that his presidential pardons committee had been selling pardons to convicted drug traffickers. Some of them were themselves convicted and sent to jail, but Alan Garcia, I think to the chagrin of many Peruvians, was exonerated in that investigation. And then since he stepped down in 2016, there's been this Odebrechts scandal, which has just mushroomed, and which is what seems to have, the net on that really was closing in on Alan Garcia.
The fact that you've got all but one of Peru's living presidents who've been tainted by scandal, is that bad news, or does it show that Peru's democracy is no longer accepting corruption?
I think it's the latter, definitely. I mean, on the one hand, obviously, there is rampant corruption in Peru. I think most serious objective observers of Peruvian society, politics, would note that. It goes from traffic cops taking bribes from drivers all the way up to cabinet members and presidents. And I think in many cases with these presidents and cabinet ministers, the evidence that is now public is really very strong. But the fact that now that evidence is public, that the media and especially prosecutors are really subjecting these public officials, elected officials, to such scrutiny, really seems to be a significant step forward. And possibly there is a sea change. Hopefully there is a sea change going on in Peruvian society and more generally Latin American society regarding corruption.
Yeah, you mentioned Odebrecht. It's been 5 years now since Operation Car Wash started in Brazil. This construction company has its tentacles, it seems, throughout Latin America, as far away as places like Angola as well. And what can we say? Because we think we've seen it all, and yet more revelations keep coming.
Well, this is it. Odebrecht is just, it's the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, the company has now admitted paying nearly $1 billion in bribes to public officials from across Latin America and even, as you mentioned, in Africa to get these really very significant public works contracts. And it's a kind of a Pandora's box. It started in Brazil. The case, it's sometimes known as the car wash case because it actually started with an investigation into a car wash in Brasilia, and from that it's just mushroomed, taking in all kinds of very important elected officials across Latin America. And I think certainly outside of Brazil, no country has been more affected so far than Peru, where, as you say, all four of the living previous presidents, well, all three now, I should say, have been affected by or implicated in Odebrecht investigation.
We saw in Brazil that it led to a disillusion and when it came to the entirety of the political class. And some are surprised to see how this fight against corruption has led to the election there of Jair Bolsonaro. What's next for Peruvian politics?
Well, this is a really good question, and there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, Peruvian politics are notoriously unstable, and I think no serious commentators would dare to predict what will happen in the next presidential elections in 2021. It is possible that some kind of dark horse candidate from the far left or the far right emerges, and the Peruvian pattern would be, the historic pattern would be that doesn't really become clear until the last weeks before the election itself. Possibly the biggest reason why that won't happen is that Peru has these very high and very controversial obstacles to political participation here. To start a new political party, you need, I think it's the signatures of 4% of the electorate, which is something like 800, 700,000, 800,000 signatures. Many critics call that democratic. The government is trying to change that, but it doesn't have a majority in Congress, and Congress is basically those existing political parties that are there are trying to protect themselves and prevent that. So if a dark horse candidate doesn't emerge in 2021 in Peru, that could be the biggest reason why.
Freelance reporter Simeon Tegel, your piece on the suicide of Alan Garcia is in the Washington Post. Thank you for speaking with us from the Peruvian capital, Lima.
Thank you for having me.